Three items I need to take care of this morning before we get to our message of the day. We have some introductions, I should say. Due to financial constraints that had developed about the time Pastor David was leaving and I was coming, we found ourselves in a situation where we could no longer support a full-time worship director ministry. And that was one of the first things that greeted me when I began working with this congregation, almost 2 months ago now, which is pretty amazing. And during this interim time, we still needed to move ahead, and so our search committee set about to find someone who could work with us in a part-time setting as our worship director and coordinator. After considering several who would have very capably performed the responsibility, the search committee and then our executive board came to the conclusion that a man by the name of Steve Hudgens would be the one. Now, interestingly, as we processed this, several people said, "I don't know Steve Hudgens. Who is he?" That is rather interesting because Steve has been part of our musical team for some time and is at the piano right now, and I would ask you to come forward, Steve. So I would say to those of you who did not know Steve before, you haven't been watching carefully enough. How long have you been playing for New Hope Service?
I've been here for 9 years now.
9 years. How many would you like to raise your hand and say, "I never knew Steve"? Now, no, we don't want to do that. Steve, rather than have me tell a little of your background, your musical experience, and 9 years with New Hope Church, why don't you give us a little background of what you've done musically, what you've done in the directing of various productions, plays, and so on, because you can do a better job of that than I would do.
Thank you, Pastor Gary. When you go to a concert, if you see a band, there's a front man and there's a side man. And I'm much more comfortable back behind the piano than out here front speaking like this. But I've been playing music all my life. Since I was 4 or 5 years old, I started plunking things out on the piano. But everywhere my life went, every direction that it took, every bump that was in the road, relationships would come and go, jobs would come and go. And my wife, who's sitting right here today, she pointed out, "Steve, there's been one constant in your life, and that's been music. Through everything that has come and gone, music has been the one constant." And that seems so obvious when she said that. 2001 was a very interesting year for me. A lot of losses that occurred at that time, and I found myself kind of hunkered down with nowhere to go and nothing to do. And a friend of mine, a member of this church at the time, said, "Steve, you ought to come over to New Hope and check out what's going on musically. I think that might fit your style." And it was just a matter of months later that I was plugged into the Christmas program, and I've been playing here ever since. Some of my other involvement has always been in some way involved in some kind of performance arts. I have the privilege of working now on a professional level in theater. So that's always been a part of my life, and it's my intention and my hope that with your help, with your input, that we can continue to bring excellence and meaning, relevant and current worship to this congregation, which is the reason why I'm here in the first place. So thank you for your support.
I would actually say, Steve, that the fact that there were so many people who did not know who you were was an indication that you had been doing your job very well. As we discussed this, the question came up, well, Steve is not one who is the persona, performer, charismatic leader up front. But the discussion went further and said, well, probably what we really need He can select the performers up front. But what we need is someone who can put together the structure underneath, gird it, make it solid, bring it to us every Sabbath. And we're looking forward to that ministry that we will share together with the whole congregation. Now, I would like to read just a little bit of an example. Actually, it's something my wife and I were reading just a couple of days ago at our morning worship at breakfast. And I thought to myself, maybe we're a little bit tame. So would you hold the mic for me while I read this? Revelation chapter 4. I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven, and the voice I had first heard, speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their head. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. We're a little calm, actually. Before the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. They were 7 spirits of God. And before the throne, there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. In the center around the throne were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second like an ox, the third had the face of a man, the fourth like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around, even under his wings. Day and night they never stopped saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne and say, "You are worthy, our Lord God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." Now, there's a little model for you, Steve.
We're going to pursue.
Yes, at times we get kind of stayed and stuck in traditions, whatever our tradition may be. And when we see what the heavenly throne is like, it's pretty spectacular. So we're looking forward to some good times together. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's anyone here who remembers exactly what they were doing 55 years ago today, except me. Well, there are a lot of you here who don't remember that because you're not old enough to remember that. But I remember exactly what I was doing 55 years ago today. I was having hallucinations. Yeah, that's right. The reason I was having hallucinations was at that point, 55 years ago, the first bout of a new strain of Asian flu was going around. And I am one of the world's great flu getters. When I get the flu, I'm sicker than a dog. Now, I don't know how sick a dog is, but I'm sicker than any dog ever was. And I was having the flu. My wife and I had been married for just over a month. And I was so sick. She was actually away at work during the day. And I was lying in bed, going back and forth between fierce chills and terrible sweats. And I finally decided, my temperature had been ranging up 105 and higher, and I thought, well, maybe I ought to take my temperature. So I went and got the thermometer. And you know how mercury thermometer is? You have to shake it down. Well, it only took one shake, and I threw it on the floor and broke it to pieces. Didn't have enough strength to hold on to the thermometer. Well, my wife came home and cleaned that up and took care of me. And I realized at that point, and I realized before that too, for just a month earlier we'd gotten married, that the Lord had given me a blessing that had no comparison. And because of the difficulties that have been going on in our family and the prayers that you prayed for our grandson Nathan, who's doing fine, she was in Florida during much of the time that I have been here. But today you receive that wonderful gift that I received 55 years ago because she's here. Ray, would you stand up? I know what you're saying. Was she 5 when he married her? I know what you're saying. I'm used to that. So I'm delighted to have my wife with me today, and we'll have opportunity to share and get to know one another better. One other bit of business. Pastor David, come join me. On Tuesday, is it you go? What day are you going? Thursday. Thursday, Pastor David is going to go where they can actually understand him talk. He is in the process of enrollment in a PhD program in London, and I wanted him to tell us about that, and we will pray for him together in this new experience.
Well, I wasn't expecting this, but yes.
That's why I didn't tell you.
Thursday I leave for England, and I really don't need to be there till Monday morning, but to get the best fare, you have to go in the middle of the week, and I'll be staying with my brother who lives only 8 miles away from the school that I'll be going to. And then October 1, 2, and 3, I have 3 full days of orientation, research methods, how to go about pursuing the subject, which I've told you before in a nutshell is how the Adventist practice of ordination comes from the Catholic Church and not from the Bible. And so I want to demonstrate that and prove that conclusively with the idea of getting rid of ordination altogether. So we'll see what comes out of this, and then bring what I hope is what the New Testament practice actually is, and see what that will do for the Adventist Church.
We want to pray for you before you go, not only for your safe journey, but for your good studies. Father in heaven, we love Pastor David very much, and we want your blessing to be upon him as he enters this new venture. Open the way before him to pursue this course of study, to successfully lead us to an understanding of how you would have us to serve in not only this congregation, but in our church all around the world. Bless him as he goes, bring him back safely to us. Thank you for the blessing that he is to us and to the world church. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless. Today we begin a 2-part series on the 10 Commandments. You say the 10 Commandments. We already know all about them. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we need to look at it, because my suggestion is God's top 10, the 10 Commandments, today, Deliverance. My suggestion is that perhaps there is no text of Scripture more taken out of context than the 10 Commandments. You see it by itself everywhere, and anytime you see a text all by itself, that ought to warn you about something. You don't know the context. So we think, yeah, we know all about the 10 Commandments, but let's get the context. Because if I ask a question, how do the Ten Commandments begin? You'll probably all tell me the same thing. Well, let's try it. How do the Ten Commandments begin? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Okay, wrong answer. That's not how the Ten Commandments begin. But let's find out. Let's work our way through and find out. Turn to the book of Exodus. Exodus simply meaning the going out, the departure. Let's get the context and find out why the Ten Commandments came the way they did, when they did, and where they did. Exodus, the first chapter, beginning with verse 7. The Israelites are in Egypt. They have grown out of Joseph being there, providing for the 7 years of famine from the 7 years of plenty. Several hundred years have gone by. They have multiplied. And here's what we find. Exodus 1, verse 7. The Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceeding numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Pretty good for a couple hundred years, isn't it? Then a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Now he's planning something here. We have a word that we use for it in today's language, which is not politically correct. We call it genocide. A nasty word, isn't it? That's what he's planning. If not total genocide, at least partial genocide. Verse 11, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. You probably haven't read this for a while, because we just kind of cut to the chase to Exodus 20 and read the Ten Commandments. This is the background. This is where it comes from. Verse 15, the king of Egypt saw the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Zipporah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women, now are you ready for this? This is a nasty story, people. I'm sorry. Just have to read it to you. When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. What I would suggest for you at the outset as we're beginning to look at this is that the Old Testament is not a record of the way God would like for things to be. Rather, it is a record of the way things were and the extent to which he was willing to go, even at the potential of being misunderstood, to try and reach people. Now, is that too long a statement to remember? Let me try it one more time. The Old Testament is not a record of the way God would like things to be. Rather, it is a record of the way things were and the extent that he was willing to go, even at the possibility of being misunderstood, to try and reach people. You think that'll help you understand the Old Testament a little bit better? Because people will come up with it and say, well, no, what about this? What about that? What about the other story? Those things are terrible. Why would God do that? It's a record of the extent that he is willing to go, even at the risk of being misunderstood, to try and reach people. Keep that in mind as we look at this story. Exodus 1, verse 22. The plan was not working well enough, so Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the river, but let every girl live. Terrible story. Then we come to the story of the birth of Moses, and I'll not take time to go into detail on that. You probably remember it well. That his mother Jochebed was afraid that he was going to get thrown in the river, so she put him in the river herself, made a little basket, let it float. Oh, it all sounds so cute, doesn't it? Well, you have to stop to realize that this little kid in the river, who is probably not very old, needs to be fed once every 4 hours. Think of what it takes to maintain this child, to keep him alive in the river. And you remember the story that Miriam is watching over him, and the daughter of Pharaoh comes by and takes him out and has sympathy and says, I want this to be my own son. Leaves him with his mother for a short period of time, who then gives him to the daughter of Pharaoh. And for 40 years, minus those few early days, he is trained in the courts of Pharaoh as the as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. 40 years. What do you suppose he was like at the end of that time? Somehow we have the notion that Moses, who after all wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, or at least had some influence in producing them. I don't know exactly how much or what. Obviously, when it talks in the book of Deuteronomy about his death, he didn't write that. But these are the books of Moses. The books from Moses, the books that he wrote, the books that he influenced, the books about Moses. However we look at that, these are the books of Moses. So we are inclined to think that Moses somehow was a full-blown theologian. Well, he wasn't. For 40 years, he was educated in the schools and philosophies of Pharaoh in Egypt. I don't know how much God was able to hang on to his mind, keep him in touch with his previous experiences. But Moses was not what we would consider, Pastor David, as a PhD in theology. Maybe he was a PhD in Pharaoh's theology, but not the God of heaven. Not what you're going to have the opportunity to do. 40 years. Verse 11, chapter 2. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. This is a nasty story, people. This is the introduction to the 10 Commandments. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over you? Are you thinking you're killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" I lost my place here. Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. Okay, 40 years old. He flees and heads for Midian. Midian, interestingly enough, is the home of relatives of Moses. Midian was one of Abraham's sons through Keturah, and he went across the Sinai, the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba, and lived a nomadic life there where his people lived. Moses now flees to the land of his relatives. How long is he there? Well, 40 more years. 40 years he helps tend the flock of his father-in-law because he married one of the daughters Well, let's read it. Chapter 3. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flocks to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, which is rather interesting. It almost seems like one side of the mountain is named Horeb and the other is named Sinai. He comes from the other side and they call it Mount Horeb. When Israel comes up across the desert, they call it Sinai. He comes to the mountain of God, as it is known. 40 years he's been there working for his father-in-law. Okay, how old is he now? 80. Wow. Somehow we lose track of this and think of him as the young man who was going to be Pharaoh in Egypt and the little boy who was in the boat. This guy was 80 years old. Verse 5. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them. There's the word. I called it deliverance, but here it comes. To rescue them from the hand of Egypt and to bring them out of the land into a good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. Verse 10. So now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I said Moses was not a full-blown theologian. It's obvious from the next question. Verse 13, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out? Verse 13, Moses said, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? Are you kidding me? Moses doesn't even know his name? No, he's not a full-blown theologian. He is not developed in understanding. He has been through 40 years training in Egypt. He's been through 40 years living as a shepherd in the desert, tending the flocks. He's 80 years old, and he has to ask God what his name is. Kind of amazing, isn't it? And then God tells him. God said to Moses, verse 14, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. And this harks us forward to Deuteronomy 6, verse 3, which I'll not take time to look up, where they say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. What is significant about that? The Lord your God is one. The setting in which Moses had grown up was a polytheistic appeasement pagan religion. They had gods all over the place. The River Nile was one of the gods. It brought them fertility and irrigation. It also flooded and brought them all kinds of trouble. So in order to get the good things that the Nile provided for them and to keep them from the bad things that the Nile did to them, they worshipped it. They made all kinds of sacrifices and offerings to try to keep the River Nile functioning in a way that was compatible with life. They worshipped all kinds of other things too. Various creatures, frogs and bugs and snakes. They worshipped all kinds of things that they thought could do them harm or might be able to do them good. And the unique thing about that worship was that the various gods that they had were in conflict with one another. The frightful thing was that if you worship this god over here, it might make this god over on the other side angry. And you're constantly in this struggle trying to keep all of the gods happy all of the time. What a terrible way to have to live. Worshipping these things in nature that were positive, negative, in conflict with one another. So the plagues come. interesting thing that happens in the plague. The first plague turns the river Nile to blood. Everything, all the water, everything in it, around it, dies. God says, you love the river Nile so much, let's see how you like it when it's blood. Second one is the plague of frogs. Frogs everywhere. You go open the pantry door in the kitchen, frogs jump out. You open a pot to cook something, frogs jump out. You get some clothes out of your closet, frogs are in your pocket. Frogs everywhere. You want to worship frogs? Okay, we'll give you lots of frogs. Plague of gnats. Number 4, the plague of flies. Plague on the livestock. The plague of boils. The plague of hail. This is an amazing plague to me. Number 7, the plague of hail. Hail in Egypt? Seriously? It doesn't hail in Egypt. But the interesting thing was that it hailed to the place that it destroyed everything that was growing. Except in Goshen, where the Israelites lived. No hail fell there. Then the next plague after the hail, this is an interesting one. The next is the plague of locusts, who came and ate up everything that the hail didn't already destroy. So they worship locusts. God says, you like locusts? Have a lot of them. The plague of darkness. They worshiped the sun. And it went dark for 3 days, except in the land of Goshen, where Israel lived. And finally, the plague on the firstborn with the Passover angel that finally delivers Israel from Egypt. And I've skipped through them rapidly. You can read them for yourselves. But this is the context of the deliverance. As they come out, they cross the Red Sea, they go through the desert, and they come to the mountain of God. They have been delivered not only from slavery, they have been delivered from a corrupt religious system. So now, when we understand the 10 Commandments, we find out where it really begins. And I'm only going to give you the introduction to it today, because next Sabbath we will take on the whole subject. But look at Exodus 20. And tell me where the 10 Commandments begin. And God spoke all these words. What does it say next? I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And if you do not read that introduction to the 10 Commandments, they come across to you as a demanding, self-serving being in heaven who forces people to do his will. But if you read the introduction, you understand that the deliverance from Egypt was not just coming out of a land and slavery. The deliverance in Egypt was being delivered from appeasement religion, trying to keep various gods happy, who were out to do you in most of the time. Now, read the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord that brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You no longer have to worship all of these competing and vicious gods. You no longer have to appease them, because the Lord your God is one, and he loves you. Unless we come to understand that the 10 Commandments are given to us in the context of deliverance, we will portray God as a vindictive tyrant. But when we understand that the 10 Commandments are to bring us deliverance, deliverance from babies being thrown in the river, thou shalt not kill. Deliverance from rape and plunder, stealing people's property, violating the women. When you begin to understand that the 10 Commandments are not demands from a tyrant, but are deliverance, then you realize that Exodus is not just moving out of a land. It is moving out of a violent, sinful world into the hand of God, who loves you and delivers you from the evil that would befall you otherwise. We'll talk about it more next Sabbath, to unpack the Ten Commandments and see how they are deliverance coming out of a sinful world.